y'all, it's Sarah, and I've got some spring Easter to do for us today. I am taking a page out of my scrapbooking days and want to show you a project trying to use some scraps of scrapbook paper. I've got some goodies here in my bin. I've got just some Dollar Tree sanding blocks, some Mod Podge. I've got some of my Dollar Tree kitchen sponges cut down. Got a popsicle stick. I have this really cool tool from Plaid that's for decoupaging. It's called a brayer. You can do it with a popsicle stick, but if you've got cool tools, you might as well use them. I've got some round shapes for tracing. I've got my Readi-board brand foam core. If you guys don't know what this is the poster board stuff right next to posters in your school supply and office supply section. You can kind of see from the side here, it's a little bit thicker than normal poster boards. It's got foam in the center. This usually comes in 20 by 30 sheets, and you can find it at retailers like Dollar Tree, Dollar General, Wal-mart, any of those kind of places. It usually runs $1 or less a sheet. Quick tip, Walmart usually runs theirs at 88 cents, but my Walmart never has any of them for that. So find it where you can find it. I'm partial to this brand because I like the surface, the way it takes my paint. You can kind of see over here. I'm going to be using different scrap pieces from this, but you can see I have some that's already faux wood painted. For this tutorial, because the wood look takes a little more detail, these tutorials are separate on my channel, and there's lots of different options on choosing wood tones and wood colors. I'll be sure to try to link at least one below so you can kind of get the idea, but you can really customize this look. I've got some blank white pieces. All of mine are cut down to 3 inches. And I'm going to tell you, there is no particular reason that you have to use 3 inches other than my favorite ruler happens to be 3 inches. That's what got me started on that scale. It's a really easy size for me to grab and maneuver, so that's why I use 3 inches. It's not a big deal. The other thing is I'm going to show you the same method, but using a hula hoop. If you don't like the idea of tracing this way, that's pretty much everything I want to cover. I want to dive into this project. There's some details to it. It's actually really simple though. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so my first step, I am going to go ahead and get my egg shape drawn out. That way it kind of helps me figure out how many of my little faux wood pieces that I'm going to need to work out. So to get my egg shape, because eggs are kind of a weird shape, I want to show you what I did. It worked out fine for me, but I'll show you an alternative method. So I've got, obviously, an old worn out pizza pan here. This one is about 16 inches, so it's a pretty good size, especially working on this that has this 20-inch width. I'm going to try to do this sideways, guys, so that you can see the full length of what I'm doing, but it is a little awkward to work from the side. So I'm just going to line this up close to the end here. I'm going to come around. I don't even have to trace the full thing, but I need enough of it to get started here. And I want to kind of leave that in place, actually, just to see where I want to line this other. So I have just a styrofoam plate here. This one is roughly around 9 inches-ish, I think. So I'm going to align it probably right about there. So I've got my two almost kind of circles. Now, I want to tell you what my first instinct was. So my first instinct was to come up here and just draw a straight line. Let's see, I want to find kind of this top point. I want to make sure that I'm basically starting at the same location at the top of my egg here. So I'm just going to mark on each side of my circle here. You can see what I did there. So my instinct was to try to come in, go from here to here with a straight line. And what that ended up giving me was an avocado. So if you want to make a giant avocado for something, now you know how. I want to do the same thing on this guy. I want to make sure that my lines are kind of aligning on the same side of my circle here. So mark this side, even with that side. So I'm going to come up to here and here and draw that straight line. And you can see now we kind of have an avocado. However, I did not want an avocado. I wanted an egg. So what I ended up doing is just kind of using this line as a guide. I came out from there and just rounded out this little line. You can kind of see maybe my lines, how that went. Same thing on this side. It kind of gave me a point of where I would align things. And you don't have to strive for 100% perfection, because the way this is going to turn out, it's going to be a very rustic egg. It's going to be a little bit busy. So if you don't get those sides perfect, I think you can still find a way to make it manage and have a perfectly adorable egg. So there you go. Now we have an egg shape rather than an avocado. Guys, if you want an avocado, there you go. Now you have an avocado. But your next step is going to be to go ahead and cut your egg out. Now, I said I was going to show you a cheater trick. If this seemed a little more than what you wanted to do, and you happen to have something like this around, you need an extra pair of hands. And since I didn't have an extra pair of hands for recording, if you can get someone to take the end of this guy and kind of bend it in while you trace it, you have a wonderfully beautiful even egg. If you can see that, if you just get somebody to bend it in for you while you trace it out, that way maybe you can knock out a couple of these guys without having to do this little bit of extra work. So once you cut that out, and I just cut mine out with just my razor blade, just like I always do. It's a lot simpler to me on these rounder shapes, to be honest, without trying to get like any sharp cuts and corners. And you can see mine is not 100% perfect, but it's okay, because when I put my wood planks on the top of this, it's going to hide most of that. And I'll be able to even out any spots that I might not have felt like they were perfect. So I want to show you what we're actually covering this with. You can see I have this fabulous mess going on. These are all pretty much scraps from other projects, and I'm going to try to knock these out using them in this project. You can start out with a fresh piece, and in some spots you may need just one long piece in order to get the width of your egg. So I've got some pieces. This is a video that shows the dry brushing over the wood. I've got some pieces that obviously they're a little damaged. I'm still going to try to use these up. I've got some that are already faux painted. Some of them had some weird spots on it that I'm just going to try to still maneuver and use. So let's dive into this, because this one is... There are some precautionary things that I want to talk about in this. So I typically tell you that Mod Podge and foam core don't always go hand in hand. There can be a lot of warping if you play with your Mod Podge too heavily. I typically try to tell people it can cause problems. It can cause warping. It can cause peeling. It can cause some things if you don't take extra care. So I tend to not necessarily throw it out there as a recommendation, but I actually wanted to show that it can be used. You just have to do it a little differently than what you would do if you were actually using wood. So I'm going to start... I'm going to look through my little scraps. I went ahead and cut some of these scrap pieces down to 3-inch widths. Save me some time. I'm going to start first with just a plain white background piece. I am going to do one full solid piece on this. So here is where I want to talk about it being a little tricky. We can't cover this. Typically, you see crafters when they use Mod Podge, especially on wood or MDF or any of those kind of non-porous, non-paper surfaces, you pretty much douse everything with Mod Podge. And by the way, I am using matte Mod Podge. This is made by Plaid. Thank you, Plaid, for sending me this. I wanted to tell you guys that this was my welcome package, part of my welcome package from Plaid. Got some great Mod Podge choices and this cool little tool, which I actually have as a scrapbooker, but I wanted to show you guys. Thanks, Plaid, for these goodies. But I'm using matte. It works well for this. Let's go ahead and jump in. So I'm not going to put it directly on here because there's a tendency to want to overdo it. You could do this with napkins. It doesn't have to be scrapbook paper. It could be something that you found that you printed. This is kind of where I want to emphasize. You notice that I am using just one of the Dollar Tree kitchen sponges cut up into a couple little pieces. Because we cannot saturate this, and it looks like that I am going to saturate it, but I'm not, because the sponge is going to take back most of this, and it's saturating my sponge so that I can work on it with the rest of it. So saturation is the last thing that we really want with foam core. If you've already played with it, you know that moisture is a problem. It can show up weirdly after everything dries and you think you've got a good project, and all of a sudden it has shrunk up and it has bowed out on you. So we're trying to avoid that, and that's what these little extra steps are. I've got that done. Now I'm showing you a solid one first, and then I'm going to show you how to get some other ones. So I've got that done. Now, this is where these brayers are cool. If you're somebody that does like the idea of Mod Podge or anything like this, this is basically kind of just a roller piece. I do kind of dig it for foam core, and here's why. You don't have to worry about it denting in your foam core. We know that you can make dents and impressions very easily on this stuff. This is less likely to do that because you can just roll it across. Helps push out any air bubbles. It gets good adhesion. It spreads whatever Mod Podge that you have on under there really, really evenly, so that the issues that we typically have pop up with foam core, as far as wet products seeping through this paper surface and getting the adhesive underneath wet and causing it to peel, is less likely to happen because it's smushing it out a little more evenly. It's going to dry a little more evenly. It's just extra precaution. I don't want to see anybody get to a point where they've got a great project going, and at the very end, it fails on them simply because of moisture problems. So one of the other things that for this one in particular, since it's a full sheet one, that I want to do is, that was part of the reason I wanted to get my sponge really saturated here. So I'm going to go ahead and come down these edges. And this will help prevent some of the peeling. I don't want to cover this whole thing, to be honest, for this. And you could, however, I'm going to show you that the more coverage you put on this with Mod Podge, the more moisture, whatever, it's going to want to bow really heavily on you. This one I tried full coverage. I don't know if you can see that sheen. This is for me straightening it out, trying to put something heavy over the top of it and trying to flatten it out. And this is still my end result. And then when I tried to straighten it out, my paper started to buckle. So I want to point that out, that's why I'm taking the extra precautions that I am. So I've got this piece ready. This is pretty much, I love this thing. This is pretty much ready and prepared. I'm going to come in and just trim the extra bit off of there. Scrapbook paper comes in 12 by 12 typically, so the largest of my covered pieces is just going to be 12 inches, and that's fine because of the way that we're going to piece this together. So here is where I stand right now. I'm going to give this a moment to dry on this piece. The next one that I go to start working on, I won't give it as much time to dry, and you'll see why. But once this has had like a little moment, especially for your edges to dry, that's really where you want it. By adding the Mod Podge down this edge like I did, what that's going to help do is keep this paper surface from peeling off. And I'll go ahead and peel off this bottom one so you guys can see what I'm talking about. If you're not familiar with how this stuff is constructed, I don't necessarily need this bottom part because it'll be glued down. But this paper is super thin on this surface. It comes apart so easily that this is why I take the extra care that I do. And you can see this one already kind of a little bit wants to bow up. So as they're drying, if you feel like you might have went a little overboard, put something on it while it's drying. These things can be very, very fickle. So I think this has had enough time to dry. I'm going to come in on this scrapbook paper for this one in particular because I like how it ended up looking. You can see I'm actually sanding the scrapbook paper surface. I'm not sanding the foam coral mess. So I'm just going to sand all along on here and kind of age this, kind of distress this. I liked this pattern and I liked this pattern. So I really wanted a couple of these that were just solid, but I'm going to show you how to do this as, it kind of distressed. So that's my scrapbook paper showing through. That is not my foam core. That's still the scrapbook paper surface. Most of my suggestions go towards trying to prevent your foam core from breaking down on you because it just doesn't have the durability that wood does. And the more you play with it, the more familiar you get and you start to learn your limitations. So I have that piece ready. Now I could do a couple things at this point. I could come in and do my edges like I typically would and make sure that they're wood looking. But since it's like this, you could get away with it either way if you want to save yourself from the mess. There's a couple pieces that I'll be doing that I likely would need to do that. But here's a start. Now we're going to intermix these kind of all together. So my next thing is to show you one that's kind of distressed. And to do that, let's see what piece I want to play with. Let's go with this guy. This one is a really thin one. The one I was just playing with was a little thicker. This one's not quite as thick, so this one should be pretty easy to work with. And it's already at that 3-inch stage. I'm going to come in and I'm just going to tear this thing a little bit. There you go. I've just got a piece torn off. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and tear this off just to make it easier to put my Mod Podge on. So you can kind of see where that stands. I'm going to do the same steps. I'm going to go ahead and Mod Podge this part. And you notice we're not going back over it. We're not doing really a lot of Mod Podge on the surface. If you do this too soon, now my pieces, these are all scraps and they've been sitting around for a long time. So technically the paint on these have really, really cured. If you do this too soon after painting your faux wood look, I'm going to tell you, learn from experience. If it has not properly cured, and I don't mean just dry, but like properly cured, and there's a difference in those two things. The Mod Podge, when it hits your faux finish, can blur it out. So you end up with kind of just a brown blurry mess. So be aware of that. I've already done that. I've been asked if you could seal your foam core pieces with Mod Podge. And I usually say no, and that's why. Because if you do it too soon, it blurs all of your cool graining and all of that just went out the window. So here's where I stand with this. And I've just put it along the edge. I'm going to trim it off. So I actually tore mine a little bit when I was trimming it off, and I'm really actually cool with that. I'm going to take a little more of my Mod Podge. This is where you got to play it cautious. I also want to explain, the larger the piece that you put this Mod Podge on, the more likely it is to bow. That has to do with the paper surface getting wet. It expands, contracts when it dries, shrinks up, and then you have that bowing scenario. And the bigger the piece is, the more likely it is to do that because so much more coverage. So a small little piece like this, you're likely not to show any kind of warping or bowing on that. So now that I've got a little Mod Podge there, right here on these torn edges, I'm just barely coming in. You guys can't even see it because that's how little of it that I put on there. While it's still damp, this is the one where I said you don't have to wait for it to dry. While it's still damp, now this is a really thin, super thin scrapbook paper. So I'm not really sure how well that's going to work on there, but we're going to find out together. So I'm leaning my sanding sponge more to the paper side and less on my wood. And while it's damp, it's going to, or while it's covered with the Mod Podge, it's going to break down some of that edge, some of that torn edge, and sand it down. Now, if you sand a little bit on your faux wood look, it's okay, but the further you go, the more it breaks down that surface. It's always the same. Know your limitations with the foam core. It only does so much. So once again, I'm leaning more towards the scrapbook paper side than I am the wood side. I'm going to go ahead and do these edges of the scrapbook paper. I've almost kind of torn that section up, which is fine. I will take a little bit of my sponge and just kind of rub that down. So we've got like this really kind of roughed up little portion, and it really works better on the slightly thicker scrapbook paper, and you'll see. So I wanted to show you guys that, and you can kind of see on the thicker one, it really kind of breaks that paper down, and we're only wanting to break the paper down. We're not really wanting to break your foam core surface down. I've got a lot of pieces that I've already pulled together and done. You can see for the ones like this, I literally just sanded this paper really, really well. Now I've got this awesome faded look. There's a lot of scrapbook paper out there already that is made with this really aged vintage look. This one was fairly bold. You can kind of see the difference here and sanding it down versus how it came. This is the same print, and you can kind of see the difference there. So I did that in order to really age this and look like it had been worn down. You can kind of see the difference on some of these. So pull together your scraps, whip together however many pieces that you're really wanting to emphasize, because I'm going to actually be mixing the faux wood in with this and not just solid pieces or not just half and half pieces. You could go really interesting. I'm going to show you. You could go really interesting. Like here is a strip that's been torn. I could place a piece here, place a piece there. Then I've got this really broken down look. And I can actually do that. I've got this piece right here that was cut off. Look, you guys, you can see a print of my gloves there. It's just got all kinds of weirdness. It's got the lines from where I stacked them before they were fully dry. I'm still going to use this thing. I think sometimes the more issues that you can have in your faux wood looking pieces, the more realism that it tends to give you. So I'm going to do this piece like that and just see how it turns out. I'm going to pop it down in this corner here. And so when I say that you can use scraps from scrapbooking paper, you really can. If you want to do this with using a paintbrush to put your Mod Podge on, you can do that. But the reason that I'm using the sponge is I'm very less likely to overdo it with the Mod Podge and cause myself problems. So, oops, must have missed a spot there. I did. That's the other issue for me, since I can't see all that great. Using such a small amount of Mod Podge makes it a little harder for me to see the surface. So I'm going back on these edges once again, and I'm hitting just right there. And like I said, guys, my faux wood look has had, some of these scraps are months and months old. So they really have had time to cure. That way I don't have to worry about it being blurry when the paint hits, or when the Mod Podge hits my painted surface here. Now that that has kind of done, it's still a little damp. Oh, that sanding block, I think, has seen better days. Let's go to this one. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but I'm leaning over this way. Can you see what that does? It kind of breaks down those edges. And you can take that as extreme as you want to, less extreme. I'm going to continue to sand this one down so that it's as faded and aged out as some of these other ones. And once you start getting down to that exposed wood, kind of move yourself along, or that exposed faux wood, move yourself along. Now, you could always come in here once you have this part done. Once you have your coverage here, you come in with a dry brush and dry brush over this and add even more detail over your kind of paper surface here. So just take a dry brush and do something like that over it. That would look really cute. I'm going to go ahead and put a few more of these together, and then we're going to assemble our egg. So guys, when I talk about preventative measures, I wanted to show you what can happen. Now, I don't know if you can see that. I covered one really, really saturated with the Mod Podge because I wanted you to see some of what can occur. Let's see if I can peel any of this off now to show you. Can you guys see that? Do you see the effect here on my paper surface to my foam core? Can you see that surface has disconnected? I don't know how well you can see that. It has bubbled up now. It is no longer attached to its foam. Can you see that wiggling around on there? All of that has lumped up. This is what happens when there's too much moisture on the surface and it starts coming apart. You can see it created a pocket in there and all of that started lifting. That's why I'm usually leery of suggesting anything with Mod Podge, because it does take a really particular hand on getting it to work without having, you can see here where this side is still sealed. It has really started to show some damage on this board, or this faux board. You can see that paper has lifted off of there and is just kind of floating on that surface, all papery and wonky now. So I wanted to show that just as a cautionary tale that when I say be careful, this is why. I just don't want to see that end up happening kind of at the end of your project. So I'm going to bring in my big egg now, and I've got all these random pieces. I'm not sure which ones I'm actually going to use. I gave myself some variety. I'm bringing in kind of this scraps variety pack here, and I'm basically just going to lay these out wherever they are likely to fit. I do want to start either at the top or the bottom of my piece. Just to me, it makes it easier to cut at least one edge super close. You do that however which way you want to, and whatever size strips that you use might affect how you decide to lay that out. So I'm gonna tinker with some pieces here and see kind of where they need to line up. You're going to have some overhang, or you're going to want some overhang so that we can trim this back down again. So now you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about here. I've got my pattern pretty much figured out from top to bottom. I'm going to use the little bit left over from this piece to go up at my very top. And I'm going to go ahead and start gluing some things down. I'm just going to be using regular Dollar Tree hot glue. I want to try to get this bottom alignment fairly decent so that everything else kind of lines up pretty good as we go up and we don't have a whole lot of crookedness. If you want to draw a line in or some lines in to be a guide, you can go ahead and do that now before we start gluing down. But I'm just going to kind of wing it here. A couple things. When you're playing with the Mod Podge, if you get your nails done, wear something over your nails because I struggled to get that off. So I'm just going to come in with regular Dollar Tree hot glue and start this process, get it glued down, and then I'm going to come back in, trim it out, and use maybe some of these extra pieces that I trim out to fill in some of these spots. And I'm going to glue this thing pretty heavy. The only downfall to doing it like this is that it is a little more difficult to cut across where the hot glue hardens. So be aware of that. Also, another thing that I wanted to point out that I may have not mentioned while I was playing with the Mod Podge is that a lot of times crafters will tell you when you go to put it on your paper surface to wet your paper surface first, like your scrapbook paper or your napkins or whatever it is that you're using. I do not recommend that at all on this process with the foam core, because wetting it obviously is going to bring in moisture issues. So keep that in mind. I do want to say that, see this little perforation here, where they manufactured it and it's got the little perforated edges. When you go to align some of these, if you get those, just take your sanding block and lightly go across that. Not too heavy. You don't want to separate the paper from the top, but just a little bit so that you can kind of get those things to bump up to one another. So now that that first one is securely glued in place, I can go ahead and get these other ones moving along. So that's what I'm going to do. And now that I've got kind of a placement here, this makes it a little easier to not deal with cutting through the hot glue along this edge. So now I can place it this way and not have to cut through as much hot glue overage right here on this side. So my pieces are glued down and you can kind of see this is a very simplified version of this look. I do plan on going a little further into this and a little more technical with this idea, but I wanted to start with something that would be easy for even the most beginner at this. So that's where this is geared for, but it's still a cute, fun idea. Now that all those pieces are glued down, I've got my egg shape. All I've got to do is come in and trim this out, and I'm just going to do the same thing I started with, is my straight razor blade, and just follow along my original shape. If I've got any issues that I didn't like with my original shape, now is a good time to try to clean those up as I'm trimming. And you can see doing on these round edges is pretty simple. This was what I was talking about with the hot glue overhang. That's usually kind of the biggest struggle on going in and trimming this out later, is that overage that you can get. I did a pretty good job everywhere else, other than this first beginner piece at my very bottom. So I'm going to continue to just go ahead and trim this out. So finishing touches, y'all. This is where I'm just going to come in with my same paints that I used to get my wood graining. Go ahead and do my edges so that they're all kind of solid looking. And there you go. You have a big giant decorative egg. Mine, I am likely to either prop on my fireplace. I'm not going to put a stand on it. I'm likely to prop it on my fireplace or actually pop it up on the wall. just using some command strips. But there you go. It's a fun little project. It's a good way to use up scraps. It's a good way to go into old stash and use up scrapbook supplies. This is all I got for you in this video. I know it was kind of long, but there were a lot of things I wanted to cover on doing this. That's all I got for you. I hope you guys get a chance to do a little crafting, and I'll talk to you soon.